of Florence's biographers talked about her religion as a bywork, something she did to fill in her time while she waited to become a nurse. But the sorts of things she wrote, I think that rather skews the idea of Florence as somebody who had a call. So much so, in fact, that if I hold up this book, this is one of 16 volumes of Florence's writings that have now been published on all sorts of topics, certainly not just nursing. Florence was born in Italy, Florence, Italy, hence her name, in 1890 as the second daughter of Fanny and William Nightingale. Both of these were from upper-class families in England. William had inherited the fortune of his uncle. The Nightingale fortune, had to change his name, and as you all probably know, inheritance passed down in the men there, and so he had inherited from a bachelor uncle. Her maternal grandfather was the Unitarian William Smith, who had been working with Wilberforce against the slave trade, and he also worked a lot on trying to get non-Church of England people into public office, which wasn't the rule at that point. What was the religious affiliation of Florence? I'm going to try and move these photos over. Good. What was the religious affiliation? She's very complex. In fact, she's hard to work out, and I think mostly she's somebody who read and thought about a lot of different things and made her own decisions. Her heritage was Unitarian. She was raised formally as a Church of England, but they attended a Wesleyan chapel in their estate up north, and she was very positive about John Wesley and his work. She did consider becoming Roman Catholic because that meant she could join an order, but a priest told her she would not be able to obey a mother superior, and that her theology was a little questionable anyway. She explored a lot of other religions, but basically I think she would say that she's a mystic who sought union with God, and we'll talk about that a little later on. Yeah. They had two estates, the family, one up in Derbyshire in the north around the industrial areas, and one down in Hampshire, Embley. Embley is now a boys' school, and the one in Derbyshire is now a bed and breakfast. This is it today, glamorous bed and breakfast, and the photo there is me meeting with the current owner in Florence Nightingale's room where she used to stay when she was there. Florence grew up a very frustrated, religiously absorbed, and woman who thought she was different as well. She was in many ways. She hated the drawing room because women of her status were expected to sit in the drawing room, read books to each other, sew, go out in drives. She called it the location from hell, especially because reading to each other, she said, was like water torture. It was as if you had your hands tied behind your back, you had water being poured into your mouth, but the difference was that if that was really happening, you would die, but you never ever died from people reading to each other. She was very concerned about her wealth versus the poor villagers around the estates, and did everything she could to go and help the poor in the estates. Her father was Cambridge educated, and so he, although he didn't have sons, he educated Florence and her sister Parthy in languages, history, philosophy. Florence absorbed everything more so than her sister. When she was 17, Queen Victoria was crowned and started her reign. Florence had her first call, a call from God, not specific, but it gave her great encouragement because it meant that she was not destined, she felt, to be in the drawing room for the rest of her life. She had a call to help the poor. In 1887, both Florence and Queen Victoria celebrated their 50-year jubilee. The Queen, obviously, 50 years since she went on the throne. Florence, not 50 years since nursing or birth or anything, but 50 years since she had first been called by God. Despite the call, the family went on a year-long trip to Europe, and it was a wonderful time for Florence. She met politicians, academics, theologians. They were all very highly connected. She became totally absorbed by new ideas for her mission or her call, and all through it, she struggled not to be diverted by all this society from her call. That carriage is the one built by her father so they could tour in Europe for a year. When she got home, there was no change. The family expected her to settle back. Everything she tried to do was thwarted by the family. She had no further call, and so she was convinced that God had said she was unworthy. However, she's surrounded by politics where she is. Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, was a neighbour at Hampshire, and his nephew, Lord Ashley, befriended Florence and kept slipping her any government reports on reform, poor reform, because he knew that Florence was interested in this. So she'd get up crack of dawn, study these reports for the first 3 or 4 hours, and then she would go about her usual jobs of having to count the silver and whatever else was going on. At 27, she went to Rome with her friends, the Bracebridges. And this brings out this whole religious call idea again. She went to the Sacred Heart Sisters in Paris and spent a length of time learning the spiritual disciplines of the order, which she would do for the rest of her life. At this point, she considers converting to Roman Catholicism in order to join an order, because she saw this as her only hope of getting away from the family and doing what she wanted to do. Very importantly, she met Lord Sidney Herbert there. He was Secretary at War, and his wife Liz. And they actually were in a group with Reverend Manning, thinking to convert from Church of England to Catholicism. When she also refused, after a 7-year courtship, Richard Monckton Milnes, because although she thought it would be wonderful to work for a great cause with him, she said she didn't want to be working towards her domestic chores. He actually stayed friendly with her and has a wonderful quote when she went to Crimea by saying, "You can undertake Crimea, but you can't undertake me." He kept on encouraging her for the rest of his life. The family were furious because they wanted a good marriage for Florence. And this was important because in those days, with the inheritance passing down through the men, if Florence's father died, the mother and the 2 daughters would have been destitute, because it would have gone on to the relatives. When she was 30, she goes to Egypt with the Bracebridges and these friends of hers. The family said it was to cure her fantasies. She had studied Champion's hieroglyphic work through the Rosetta Stone, so she knew all about that, and she was absolutely thrilled with the temples, the history, religions. They sailed down the Nile for 2 or 3 months. And during that time, when she was looking at all these different religions and ideas, she had another call from God to work for the poor. On her 30th birthday, Florence writes, "No more childish things, no more love, no more marriage, only what thou willest me to do." On the way home, she secretly visits a Protestant training school in Kaiserswerth in Düsseldorf in Germany. Pastor Fleidner had set up this place, an order that didn't have vows, that was working for the poor. And now Florence knew that she had found her dream, at least something to work towards. She left Kaiserswerth so brave, as if nothing would ever vex me again. But as soon as she was home, she was in disgrace for having gone there, and told she had to devote the next 6 months of her year to her sister, because her sister was so upset about it all. Florence writes, "Why, God, cannot I be satisfied with their life? What am I going to do?" And it's during this time she starts putting down some of her thoughts, which would later be suggestions for thought. Next year, the sister wants to go to a German spa for 3 months, and so Florence agrees to take her so long as she can go to Kaiserswerth at the same time. And there she writes this booklet about how English women could go and train as deaconesses to work for the poor in Germany. We visited the place that it's now the Florence Nightingale Krankenhaus, a huge place, and they have a very good museum there of Florence. Finally, at age 33, her father has got the message, and he agrees to finance Florence while she becomes volunteer administrator for poor governesses in Harley Street. Again, if you think about it, it's again this call to the poor. Governesses were useful as long as there were children, but often they were just thrown on the heap afterwards, and so needed to be cared for. Liz Herbert is on the board. And so it's Lord Herbert, Secretary of War, who sends her with a group of women to the Crimea in 1854, like the French Sisters of Charity. And that's important because the Crimea War, although it was a bit of a disaster in many ways, it was the first time they actually had a reporter from the London Times on ground in Crimea. And so he's writing back with all sorts of comments about Florence and what's happening. And one of the comments was that the French army had the Sisters of Charity to look after the women, the needs, and the British army, of course, had no one. So this is what Lord Herbert gives Florence about 6 days to gather a group of women together and set off for the Crimea. Now, for your history lesson, we've got the Russian Empire up here. The war was all about the Russians were trying to move down into the Ottoman Empire and take over. And so the French and the British decided this was not a good idea. So they would send troops to help Turkey. Now, we all know about Crimea, this peninsula, more recently because of the Russians coming down to take over there. But all the battle was up here in this area around Sebastopol. Different armies, Balaclava, Alma, and so forth, different battles. But if you were wounded, you then had to be loaded on a boat, flat boat. The boat waits until they have a full boat before they come across the Black Sea, which was fairly rough. And so it would take 3 or 4 days to come across and be offloaded at Scutari here, which is where the British Army had their hospital, where Florence went. You know the area from Gallipoli down here. The problem was, by the time they got here to Scutari, you then had to find some Turkish people to carry you up the cliff to where the hospital was. As well as that, there was cholera and typhoid, so if you didn't die of your injuries coming across, you could easily die of a disease. For those of you who've been to Istanbul or Constantinople, as it was, these are where over here, this side of the Bosphorus, you have the mosques. On the other side, you can see a little strip there with a tower. That's Scutari, and that's the Turkish army headquarters, which they handed over to the British to look after the soldiers. This is a close-up of it. It's a huge building with 4 towers and miles of corridors, and the scene you usually see for the British Army is this sort of a scene where there were just beds all along, thousands of beds of soldiers that had been brought from the battlefield. Florence set in there. Some doctors were supportive, others were opposed to her, particularly because, one, they didn't want the women around there, and secondly, because she had links to the Secretary at War, Lord Herbert. And she was a forceful character, and so if she had any sorts of problems that obstructed her, she went straight to Lord Herbert. She was more, talk about nursing, but in those days, nursing was purely just looking after the people, getting sanitation going, making sure they were all fed, what injuries they could mend and so forth. She's more of an administrator and problem soldier. Again, it is her call to look after the poor. Common soldier at that time was drawn from wherever they could find them in. Sometimes they would just go into pubs when everyone was drunk and just take a bunch of the men and send them off to the battlefield. There were shocking conditions, and this is what really appalled Florence, how they were being treated. So she started libraries. She also got teachers to come across and educate them because so many couldn't even read. She got one of the top chefs in a club in London to come out and improve their food. And interestingly, she set up banking services because these fellows were being paid a pittance, but they had no way of getting the money back to their impoverished families at home. She didn't stay in one place. By horse, by boat, by carriage, she rode all the battlefields in the north to make sure that things were going properly up there. And she grieved the dead. She was devastated by the number of soldiers that were dying, particularly at the beginning. So she wrote a letter to each family to tell the family how that they had died in comfort with somebody to sort of support them. We visited the barracks a number of years ago. It's now high security Turkish military. We had to get special passes and whatnot to go there, but they have this museum for Florence in one of these towers. But the sad part is to look at the graves. The graves, miles of graves with just these inscriptions on them about soldiers who had died. This is just one of them, aged for 30. Welsh Fusiliers, wounded in the Battle of the Alma, made a staff officer but dies there of fever. When the war was finishing, the British were ready with a warship to bring her home. She was their hero. They were ready with the bands to greet her in London, but she crept away under the name of Miss Smith. She came home on her own, landed in London, stayed the night with the Sisters of Mercy that she had worked with in the Crimea, caught the train up to Derbyshire and supposedly walked home, although I think probably somebody picked her up. But she turned up in the family home totally unannounced. But that is so typical of this woman who had this vocation. Before the Crimea, and this is a portrait of her after it, she is emaciated, sick. She had nearly died from Crimea fever, in a terrible state. The family, of course, thought she would just settle back at home, but not Florence. They had raised a fund for a nursing school, hoping that Florence would build a hospital and a nursing school. But Florence had a different call. She had seen what had happened to poor soldiers, and she was going to do her best to change the army. With Dr. William Farr, she got together all the statistics. She had kept statistics of all the deaths and disease of her soldiers in the Crimea, and they put together this groundbreaking statistical analysis of their records about how what had worked, what hadn't worked, and so forth. And as a result of that analysis, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert set about to start a Royal Commission into the army. The Royal Commission was led by Lord Herbert, but it met in Florence's home, and she and a small working party basically researched and wrote the reports. The first report came out as a result of the Royal Commission. She then immediately had a Royal Commission into the Army Health in India, started because she figured the poor soldiers would be the same in India. And as well as that, she wrote a report on Indian village health, getting her ammunition and statistics from by writing to the different army places in India. And then after a year, she becomes a recluse. Now, from then on, people don't really know she's there because she's doing everything from her home. Why did she become a recluse? Firstly, Crimea fever. She probably had the after effects of being sick. Secondly, post-traumatic stress, as we'd say today. She must have seen terrible things. Thirdly, because she knew that the family would want her to go home, she decided that she would set up an office like a man. She was always quite upset about the fact that women's time was wasted, but men's time was precious. She also wanted to avoid the family because they were quite adamant that she should come home. And I argue, because I read this whole story of this woman who has a call from God, that it's a monastic lifestyle. She's carried out the spiritual disciplines. She has her vocation to the poor, and she had tried to get into a Catholic order. She had tried to form her own order of Kaiserswerth, but basically she ended up in an order of one herself. Henry Dunant, who was the man who started the Geneva Convention and the Red Cross, was inspired by Florence's work. And it's Florence that writes the British delegation's proposal to the Geneva Convention. She's also consulted by the American Civil War on the war wounded by both sides in the Franco-Prussian War. The colonial leaders all around the country, around the world, the British colonies, consulted her. She worked on Indigenous health in Australia. All the viceroys in India were sent to see Florence before they left. And she was into poorhouse reform. Again, it's working for the poor people who had no other means of support. She trained carers to look after poorhouses. In fact, Sir William Rathbone, who was a big ship owner in Liverpool, was so pleased with what she had done for the Liverpool poorhouses that he sent her flowers every day for the rest of his life. And Florence was really concerned about women. She knew the problems for married women in society, in the home, but most importantly, she knew the problem for single women, whether they were wealthy women in families or whether they were prostitutes, destitute, all sorts of single women from all classes. She wanted a job for them. She also did a lot of women's reform, because in the 1860s, a woman could not divorce her husband, whereas a man could. A woman could not leave a drunken husband, otherwise his children would be taken from her, and given to the husband. If she had any sort of income or estate in her own right, the husband could claim that estate. And so she was really involved in the independence of women. She didn't support the women's vote of the 1860s, which some people got concerned about. But she was busy with army reform, about which she knew more than anybody. And only 2 in 5 men had a vote in Parliament at that time. And so she knew that a vote for women would just be for a few elite women. And apart from that, there were so many reforms that needed to be done for women that the vote was really not the first one. She also knew it was a religious issue, because she knew that the idea of the headship of Adam was a theological issue, and that would have to be solved before the women got the vote. And actually, you'd think Queen Victoria might have helped with the women's vote, but she was absolutely furious about it. She said women were just going to de-sex themselves and make themselves ugly and heartless if they had the vote. The nursing school started. Florence didn't work there. This was the first building. She made some suggestions, but she was busy with army reform. They built a new hospital in 1871, a Nightingale hospital. She made some ideas about the different design of the hospital, but she didn't actually visit the hospital till 1882. And her notes for nursing, which is the book that she wrote, was actually about nursing for families, sick families, rather than nursing in hospital. So, the theology. She wrote an 800-page New Religion for the Poor in the 1860s called Suggestions for Thought. And this 800 pages handwritten writing is on God, natural laws, sin and evil, family, women, all sorts of issues at the time. She sent the draft to 6 different people, her father, her uncle, her Milnes, Richard Monckton Milnes, who she had jilted earlier, and particularly Benjamin Jowett, who was the Oxford Plato scholar. He didn't know who wrote it, but he said he thought it was the imprint of a new mind. John Stuart Mill, the reformer, also got a copy, and he quoted her in his speech to Parliament. So why didn't it get published? Firstly, it needed editing, and Florence herself agreed that it needed a bit of cleaning up and editing, and she was too busy to do so. Some friend of hers, the poet Clough, he was going to help her, but he died. Jowett tried to help her, but he was too busy. He was the expert on Plato, and he had been basically rewriting his Plato translations for most of his life in Balliol College. And so it didn't get published, although something got published later on. Now, this is really, so I remember to get all these points through. What's it all about, this new religion for the poor? Anglican theology, or Church of England theology at the moment, said that God wills whether you are rich or poor. Therefore, you can't do anything about it. We don't reform because this is what God has willed. It was very convenient for the British class system. Because of this, the working class had either stopped having any sort of religion, they didn't feel cared for, they had been associated with different ideas at the time, but most of them just had no religion at all. At that particular moment, you have all sorts of challenges. Biblical criticism has come across. David Strauss had, his book had been published. The Oxford movement was going on then. So the science movement, Darwin had published his writings the year before, and the essays and reviews, that was a broad church movement, including Benjamin Jowett, where they had chosen to write about some of the new theology. And of course, because of what they wrote, a lot of heresy trials happened because of that. So Florence decided that we knew a need to have a new God image. And she said that God was incarnate in the universe. And because God was incarnate in the universe, then we all just share this divinity within ourselves. She called God being the good as the metaphor, the best, what she thought the metaphor should be. We need to look at our natural laws because these are God's thoughts in the universe. And how did you find out about what the God's thoughts are? It's through statistics, because if you look at statistics, it's because you get a much wider range of thinking than just the individual person. And also this is very much more reliable than it is for revelation that is just interpreted for the few. What you do is you follow these laws and start to improve society. And also we have saviors. Saviors were people that were sent by God to help people to improve a society. Cassandra is part of this Suggestions for Thought, and again it is a sort of a fiction about women that she talks about, and how women actually has all sorts of problems that we needed to fix some about. So what sort of doctrines we may have had? She didn't like the Trinity. Her Unitarian background, I think, shows Jesus as a sort of a perfect being, but the Trinity she has particularly as God as thought, wisdom. The Son is all humanity, according to learning God's thoughts, and the Spirit is the divine in each person, where God speaks to the person. She didn't agree with atonement. She thought that was something for old ages, but in fact in the time of Victorian times they need to reform, not punish. Sin, she was not into original sin. She felt that it was about learning from our mistakes and things that we couldn't do, but as we would learn the laws, then we would, as we change society, things will be better. For example, she says that we don't pray to take the collar away, we clean up the gutter. Her theology, liberation, feminist, contextual. What she was on about, she said, you have to start with the poor and ask what is good news for the good of the poor. And then to go back to scripture and start to find what Jesus was saying, the idea of Jesus that was for the poor, and it was tried to loose the chains of these poor people rather than tell them just have their heaven in the next world. The sorts of writings of her in the British Library is one of their largest collections they have, and there are now 16 volumes of her writings. So it's not just something she did just now and again, it's the whole theology that she followed. She had this wonderful time with Benjamin Jowett, who was later on master at Balliol College. They had 30 years of correspondence, writing to each other. She knew so much Greek that she was the one that helped translate his Plato works. They chided and encouraged each other every year, sometimes writing weekly. She complained that he wasn't writing enough theology, and he said that her whole writing was too angry and that she needed to sort of calm down a little bit. He dies in 1893. At 70, she writes, "I still feel it's such a blessing to have been called. And also, when very many years ago I planned a future, my one idea was not organising a hospital, but organising a religion." She died in her sleep in 1910, aged 90. She was asked early to be buried in Westminster Abbey, but instead she wanted to be buried in Hampshire near her home and put to rest by her sons, representatives from each of the army regiments that she had worked with. In the family tomb, there are 4 sides: a big thing about her father, a big right about the mother, an even huge right about her sister, and on Florence's request, hers said, "F.N., born 12th of May 1820, died 13th of August 1910. That is the woman who had a vocation for the poor. Thank you.
Well, good. Okay. Now we have time for about 20 minutes or so of Q&A. And if you wish to ask Val a question, send me a chat message, which if you want to know how to do that, if you look down take your cursor down to the bottom central part of the screen, and you'll see chat. Click on chat. Select me with your cursor. That should address it to me, and then type your message. And I will choose from the ones I get and relay them to Val. The first one we have, Val, is for Robert Renton. I didn't understand the reference to Cassandra. What was that about?
Okay, still on here?
Yes.
Cassandra was an autobiographical fiction she wrote after she got back from Kaiserswerth when she was so depressed about not being able to do anything. And it was a fiction about how families murder their daughters, how the women have no jobs, no independent life, boredom, trivial ideas, no challenge, and the whole rule that men were in the order of creation were superior to women. And she said, women are also called to be the handmaids of the Lord and not just the lords of the manor. And so she had identified back in those days that it was the patriarchal family that was the thing that hurt women so much. And from her own experience, she felt that it was so important that women were allowed to be independent, to be their own selves, and to be called themselves, not just because of the men. She liked the idea of saviors, that these were all people that were sent at different times to help people advance in society and to learn the laws, the natural laws. And she particularly hoped that there would be a female savior sent, like she saw herself as somebody who had sent as a savior. But she said they have to wait a bit yet, because if there was a female savior, she would get into trouble, because if she said that she was more interested in doing her mission for God rather than doing the domestic things, she would be in trouble by everybody, because a woman had to first of all be the one to do what she should do within the family.
Very good, thank you. And another question from Janet Watson Cruz: where did Florence get her ideas on hygiene?
Well, I think, it was at that stage they didn't know about bacteria. That was still to happen, like when Koch discovered bacteria and what you should do in terms of bacteriology. But at the time, at least they felt that the reason why, that what you could do was to the sanitation idea, because at that time they believed that what caused disease was a sort of a miasma, you know, the sort of a vapors that came from putrefaction. And so that was what she believed in, and many at that time did. And so to her, it was a matter of health and hygiene, was a matter of trying to clean up places, sanitation, all these sorts of things, even though she didn't know about what actually caused disease. That would happen later. And of course, that made some of her ideas outdated, but at least at the time, it was something very helpful.
Very good. Coralie Ling asks, does Val think that Florence extended her theology of the poor to the more intersectional feminist theology today?
I think, you know, I think we have to see Florence as somebody in her time. You know, she doesn't, what she learnt about theology was something she read and corresponded with the thinking of the time. Got to remember that she could not go to university. She couldn't, in fact, when she wrote the New Religion for the Poor, a lot of people said to her, well, it's not just the poor that wants this message, it needs the middle class. Everyone needs the message that she's talking about. But of course, Florence felt very much that she wasn't educated in terms of academics. And so she wrote her work for the poor because she figured that that would at least be something she could do as a woman. So in terms of, I think in terms of some of our new thinking today, she was a person of her times, and what she was actually doing was looking at the needs of poor women in particular, any type of woman, to be able to have the ability to have a profession, to see themselves called from God. There was a time in the early 1990s, the 1930s, where Florence lost her, well, they certainly, nursing decided they were moving away from Florence a bit because they felt she had been so disciplined. She didn't really want women to get married because they had to be in this order of nursing, and she was disappointed if they did. And so people started to say that, you know, Florence was a bit old-fashioned, but that was when they saw her as being a nurse and trying to deal with nursing, rather, I think, than seeing her as this order, forming this order, which she thought was the Protestant or non-vows way where women could actually work for the poor. And so, you know, it was an order she was forming, I think, and that was what she saw was the way to go. So, you know, yeah, she's limited according to the issues of today, but she certainly made advances in her time.
From Margaret, has the modern church taken up any of Florence's theology? It sounds quite unique.
Well, I think in the book I've skipped so much just in this talk, but you know, I also say she's got a lot of process theology in her, which is interesting because when you think that Alfred North Whitehead, of course, is 20 or 30 years later than some of her work, so there were obviously the ideas that she had adopted at that point. I argue that she, you know, had the makings of a feminist theologian. I think she worked from the whole liberation theology and contextual theology, because she was quite happy to say that all the doctrines of the church, she felt the church was really was letting everything down because it was just a sort of a gentleman's religion, not worrying about the poor. So that was why she felt we needed a different God image, have a moratorium on ideas and metaphors of God because they weren't being very useful. And so that's why she talks about the incarnation of the divine, the good, as she called it, within the universe, in which way we are all then, in some ways, infused with divinity, and therefore we can, with the help of the Spirit, move forward. And so, yes, I think there's a lot of her writings and her theology that is showing itself in some of the process, some of the liberation theology, progressive theology of today. So I think she's really very helpful just to sort of see how she was protesting so many things in her day.
Okay, well, that's interesting, and that leads us into something that flows on from that, I think. Chris Page asks via Anne, why has Florence been cut out of religious history?
Oh, well, I think it's because once she came back from the Crimea, she basically became a recluse in her own home. She was involved in practically every reform that happened in Parliament from then on for the poor, and I've sort of mentioned some of those things. But because she went and became a recluse, people thought she died, and so basically the image of Florence became this nurse who, with the Lady of the Lamp image, because the soldiers were coming back and raving about how wonderful she had been in the Crimea. And of course, you have Longfellow writing a poem on the Lady of the Lamp. And so this became the image. And when you think about it, being somebody who did their duty as a nurse and helped the poor soldiers in Crimea is a much better image than somebody who wanted to change the army and change the world. And it was through working through different parliamentarians that she was able to achieve what she actually could do. But again, she did it in an anonymous sort of way in terms of the public. And I just see, you know, and I've been reading a bit more about her in some of these volumes again. And it's just amazing if you start thinking of her as somebody who was a theologian, who was actually wrestling with the theological ideas of the time. And there were many new things happening. But as long as she was kept in something that was respectable for Victorian women, they didn't sort of see the way she was changing theology and the world. Interestingly, Jowett, who was her good friend, also was critical about the way she wrote, because she told a lot about her experiences. And in that day, and we know this as feminist theologians, that in the 50s and 60s, you didn't talk about experience. You didn't say, well, looked at experiences, you looked at an objective, theological truth. And so the doctrines held place as if there was no contextual influence on that. And I think that was a great thing. She said, she was a mystic. She said, I'm experiencing the God within. I am growing towards union with God as I learn the natural laws of the universe. And so to her, experience is a very big deal. And I think today we're starting to realize that we don't just talk about, doctrines as objective things. We talk about the context and we talk about experience, which is something that in those days was not happening.
Very good. Anne Page asks, what were her calls, visions, heart messages, etc.? In other words, what were the nature of these calls that
she had more than 4 calls at different times. The first one was when she was 17. She was sitting in the garden at her home in Embley, and she felt God speaking to her just for God's services, to work in God's service. She didn't have a specific call the first time. It's in the second and third calls that finally she starts feeling called, that she wants to work for the poor. Again, visible calls that she had. She was a mystic from way back. Even as a child, she got into trouble all the time, because the way to escape from what she saw as the horror of the family situation, she would dream. She talks about her dreaming, which she got in trouble with, but basically she had some sort of mystical experiences, and that was her experience right through her life. She wrote a lot to Sister Mary Clare, who was from the Bermondsey Sisters of Mercy, and in those correspondence, obviously Sister Mary Clare had this mystical experiences, and Florence would write to her about that, sharing it. And if you read her thing, all her little diary notes when she's in Egypt trying to work it all out, she's talking about, today I had this experience, I felt God thought this, or God talked to me about this. And so basically she had this, what she saw as sort of mystical experiences, which were helped her to work for her call. When she talked about Christ, as she said, she believed in the spirit within, the idea of the kingdom of heaven is within. But she said the example of Christ was the one that best made it without, because she said, although she was a mystic, she was not one that hid away and sort of navel gazed, as she said it, because she said that, some of these people that had these experiences and didn't go out and actually act on them, had these experiences because she said they drank too much coffee or had not enough to eat.
Robert Hess asks, have you visited the Florence Nightingale Museum in London? And what do you think?
I have visited, yes. I have visited St Thomas Hospital. I have visited the Florence Nightingale Museum. I went there after the book was published and did a little bit of an open house or, book thing with them at the Florence Nightingale Museum in London. It's a wonderful museum. It's worth looking at, and there are many. It's in St Thomas's Hospital, and certainly worth the while if you are in London, because that is one of the areas where they have a lot of the records of Florence. What's interesting about Florence, I said that her work was in 16 volumes. I mean, huge, they're big, thick volumes of all her writings. And these weren't just written from a small place. There were 150 different places around the world that they researched where they had collections of her writings. And they collected all this together to put it in these different volumes that we read. And I went to the British Museum and over a number of visits to read her actual writings and her annotated Bible, where she had little notes all along the side of what she thought about the different writings. So, she had an incredible amount of writings that could be published, and I'm only scratching the surface here with the things she talked about. If anyone's interested, it's the collected works of Florence Nightingale, published by Wilfrid Laurier Press in Canada, and they're available for about $300 a book.
Greg Crow has asked a question which I think is pretty similar to one that you've already answered, but can you say a little more about what you call Florence's mystic experience and how that shaped her theology?
Well, I think, the fact that she was, her idea is that the good, as she called it, or God, she talks about God as thought, or the mind of the universe. And so if God is incarnate, or the good, rather than God, the good is incarnate in the universe. And so therefore God's thoughts are available. How do you find God's thoughts? It's because God's thoughts are the natural laws of the universe. You've got to think, this is a scientific age, at the beginning of a lot of scientific age at this time with Charles Darwin, and the church trying to move or not trying to move beyond the doctrines. And so she's trying to sort of talk about a way to talk about God that isn't the ordaining God, the punishing God, the God that, saves some and not others, all these things. She didn't like the Common Prayer, Book of Common Prayer, or the 39 Articles, and all the talk about how, we are worms, therefore we ask God to forgive us, sort of thing. She wanted to turn that around. She said, maybe we should start talking about how, we are trying to work with God and be in union with God. She wasn't too keen on church institutions, and that's why she always struggled with, or I struggle to find out what her church affiliation is. But she basically saw herself as somebody who could experience union with God, because God was the divinity within us all, and it was God that would lead us into, through natural laws and through acting upon them, that we would improve society. And importantly, it meant that everybody could improve society, not just those that were ordained by God. She thought it was much better to learn the natural laws and help people to learn the natural laws than revelation. She said revelation is basically, the interpretation of a few that the rest of us have to believe in. And she was challenging that and sort of saying, well, every one of us can work to learn God's laws and act upon them. she saw sin as, she wasn't into original sin. She saw sin as how, because we are human, we make mistakes, terrible things happen, but it's learning and being able to learn from our mistakes and listening to the divine within, which would help us to learn from our mistakes. So it's very much a business of, we are called to work with God in the universe and improve society.
Helen Hill asks, was her work read and discussed by people much at the time she wrote it? And was there any response from any sections of the church? Did she have any followers for her ideas, or did she write her theology in isolation?
She was in contact with the people in the Broad Church, the Church of England Broad Church, which was Benjamin Jowett, a lot of the clergy at the time in the 1860s, who wrote articles and published them under essays and reviews. And they were very much into the biblical criticism. They were criticised the church. They felt the Church of England had become just a gentleman's sort of, easygoing sort of gentleman society. And she felt that the poor had nowhere to go because they didn't feel the church cared about them. And so she's writing to these people. Clough, the poet, was one of her correspondents. All sorts of people that were actually writing theology at the time. But she was, again, conscious that she was not an educated person in terms of theology. She couldn't have gone to university. She couldn't have learned theology. What she did learn was what she learned from her own reading and discussion, but she was very bright about it. And Benjamin Jowett was very impressed, as why John Stuart Mill. A lot of the other people were most impressed with what she did. But interestingly, one of the comments that Jowett came up with about Florence's writing was that it wasn't systematic, that it didn't follow all the rules of good systematic theology. And, it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that we've started to criticize that as well, because any systems, a systematic system for analysing theology is a human construction. And so, if poor Florence was told, well, you can write about theology, but it's got to fit the systematic theology of the times. And so she was quoted as not following what she really should have been doing. But so people started to listen to her because some of her friends realised that she had a lot of good thoughts about it. Interestingly, the heresy trials followed after the essays and reviews, and Florence was actually writing the same sorts of things and in agreement with them. But because they were never finished or published at the times, she was probably excused from being charged for heresy.
Interesting. There's a question here about where you can get Val's book. I'll deal with that shortly. And one further question, which I think is the last one I have. There seems, from Eric and Margaret, there seems to be some parallels with Quaker faith in what has been said. Was she influenced by Quaker women or men?
Yeah, she was in contact with the Quaker, some Quaker women, some of the women who were interested in sort of reform of prostitution and a lot of the women's issues. Florence was actually in conversation with them, supporting some of their work, even though she didn't get always involved in everything. She certainly got active about some of the Quaker women who were working against the way women prostitutes had to be examined, physically examined, whereas the men who were made themselves the women available to them were not examined. But it was the women that had to be, brought up and examined to make sure they didn't have diseases and so forth. Florence was horrified with this, as were other women, to say that the blame was all put on the women and that law should make changes to that sort of thing. And saying she was very eclectic and she was very open to listening to everybody. And that's why she thought Wesley had such a good thing to say. She saw, because she wanted people to act, not just talk theology, they had to act. And so she felt that what John Wesley was doing was really quite incredible in his time. And so she ended up actually being influenced a lot by the Wesleyan tradition of the time. So she really did get involved in the discussion about most things, particularly about women, and really quite incredible.
Remarkable. Well, that brings us to the end of the questions. For those of you who'd like to signify your approval, if you go down to the message controls at the bottom of the screen, you'll see reactions. And if you click on that, you'll see there's hand clap, which you can do and make your feelings known to Val. Yes. Terrific. Wonderful. Val, thank you very much. That's been an excellent session, and I think people will go away far better informed about Florence Nightingale than they were before they began. And I think not only will they go away better informed, but they will be inspired by the work that she did and how far in advance of her time she really was. And you've done us a great service, so it's greatly appreciated. We do or will have a small supply of Val's book. It will cost about $55, including postage. And what we will do is, first thing next week, we will send to all the folks on our emailing list a form which, if you wish to buy a book, you can complete and send back to the PCNV office and with your money or whatever it is that you want to pay for it, and we'll arrange a book for you. So there's nothing to be done right at the moment, but you should get a contact from us next week, which will allow you to order the book. Next month meeting will of a certainty be another virtual meeting, and what we're planning is a session called Gifts of Winter. It will be pretty close to the winter solstice, and Reverend Dr. Julie Hall, Reverend Dr. Coralie Ling, and Reverend Greg Crow are going to develop a session which will be based on PowerPoint, we think, with poetry, music, and expressions and ideas of faith, particularly the contrast between light and dark, which the solstice in at least ancient times was meant to signify. That would be on Sunday, the 28th of June. So thank you very much for attendance. Very glad to see the degree of support we had. I counted 101 participants, and I know that there are several people doubling up. So that was a very good turnout and great support for Val and for the offerings of the PCNV. We do appreciate it. So thanks very much, and we look forward to being in touch with you next week. We're getting next month. Yes, we're getting a flood of chats in, Val, thanking you for your work. So it's obviously greatly appreciated. So thank you, folks. Val, I'll send in 5 minutes. I'll send another Zoom invitation to you, and we'll just have a bit of a chat after the end of it. But for everybody else, thanks very much for attending, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.